Hi, welcome to the Navigating Neurodiversity podcast. I'm Vivian, registered psychologist, and my guest today is Niamh Donnelly, principal occupational therapist at Kids First. So you might see that the set looks a little bit different today, and that's because we're here at Kids First, and thanks, Niamh, for having us. So Niamh has vast experience working with children, both in Ireland and Singapore, including those with sensory processing difficulties, feeding challenges, as well as various motor and learning challenges. So today we'll be focusing on the topic of sensory integration. But before we start, Niamh, I hear that you've been living in Singapore for the past 11 years. You're pretty much a Singaporean now. So tell us what's your favorite Singapore dish?
I'm not very adventurous with my food, but I do love chicken rice.
Okay. Which one specifically? Do you have a go-to?
Yeah, I'm actually okay with a lot of them, actually. It's very good. I think across Singapore, it's a very good dish.
Great. Good to know. And what brought you to Singapore like 11 years ago? What brought you to Sunny Island?
Yes. So my sister actually originally moved here, but she worked in a different field. She worked in accountancy, but she very much advocated for the healthcare here and the different pediatric and therapy options. So I was very intrigued to know more about Singapore, and this is where I started my career. And 11 years later, I'm still here.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah. Okay, so diving into the topic, maybe we'll start with definitions. Like, could you explain a little bit about what is sensory integration?
Yes. So sensory integration in terms of children is basically a reflection of the brain's network. So how it processes different sensory information. There's the key 5 sensory systems, but in sensory integration, we also talk about proprioception, interoception, and the vestibular system as well. Sensory integration theory reflects a lot on how the brain organizes sensory feedback and how it helps a child understand that sensory input and then functionally participate in day-to-day and different life, play, and learning tasks.
Yes. Could you define those terms a little bit? Proprioception, interoception, yeah.
Yes. So proprioception is basically the feedback from the muscles and an understanding of where the body is in space. So you might hear the term a lot, heavy work and those kind of things in sensory integration. That would be off the premise of proprioception feedback. Vestibular is our balance center and our movement center. And interoception is the body's ability to understand things like hunger, thirst, and fatigue.
Yes, and toileting as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yes. So what are some common signs of sensory processing difficulties that you see in children?
So key signs we would have a lot from parents would be, I suppose, the oversensitive children. So children that have a lot of over-responsivity to certain sensory feedback. So it might be auditory, visual, also a lot of children who might have meltdowns, struggles coping with different sensory stimulus. There's also picky eaters. We get a lot for sensory. There's obviously the under-responsive children, but that's a little bit harder to recognize.
Yes.
Because they may be the children who are a lot more passively engaged in their environment. They may be reluctant to join in with play. They may be the ones that sit back in the back of the classroom. So it's a little bit less obvious than the sensory seekers, the continuous movers. But both sides of the spectrum are there.
That's right. It's kind of like that externalizing and internalizing that we talk about in psychology as well. So what types of interventions are helpful for children with sensory integration?
Quite a broad range. The key intervention would be sensory integration therapy, which works a lot on processing the different sensations, building organization of behavior, but we reflect a lot on motor. We also do a lot on behavioral supports, especially from a parenting level as well. And we also work a lot on emotional regulation, because obviously sensory and emotions are very linked, especially in early years. So from the sensory side of things, we need to understand our body and what our body's telling us to help us regulate and understand our emotions as well. So we do a lot of kind of mindfulness techniques. We also do breathing, emotional regulation work, alongside motor, alongside behavior, and then obviously the sensory integration work as well.
Sure, sure. So just to demystify it a little bit, sensory integration therapy, like what does it look like? What are some, common activities that you'll be taking a child through?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very fun, which is great.
Doesn't feel like therapy.
Not,
Right?
yeah, especially for children that really need that movement. We do it in a gym setting, and it's a very specific gym setting that has sensory integration equipment. So we want to have a mixture of swings, we want to have climbing, we want to have motor equipment, so that we can have lots of different opportunities to engage in different types of sensory work. The session itself is very play-based, and we follow the child's lead. So we follow their interests while then giving them that just right challenge so that they can be challenged and challenge their sensory system while also feeling safe and secure with the new experiences they're having as well.
Yes, yes. I've also heard of like body brushing as a form of sensory. Is that something that's done as well?
So that's the Wilbarger Protocol. So a lot of the time that's a more passive input that you might provide for children that have a lot of sensory overload. So they may need something physical to help their body calm down, and they may need that externally to begin with before they learn how to self-regulate internally as well.
I see. Right. And I'm sure this varies across children, but what's a typical kind of timeline that parents are looking at? Because clearly, we're working with the brain, right? And I presume that takes time, but what's the typical kind of expectation that you would?
I suppose like all therapy, it can take a while for children to be receptive and understand the therapy process as well. Especially with sensory integration therapy, we really want to make sure that we're giving a broad range of different experiences and also seeing that adaptive change in children in terms of whether it's meltdowns and the reduction of meltdowns, building regulation patterns, building attention. Again, for us, we want to do that over a period of months to begin with so that we can ensure that we're doing the correct job for the body and the brain as well.
Yeah. So it's weekly sessions and usually for a couple of months, right? Over time. Yeah. So what are some ways that, because, parents would say some of them do try to set up a gym at home, right? They'll buy gym equipment. But what are some everyday things, simple things that they could do maybe at the playground or at home, routines to help their child?
We focus a lot on embedding sensory routines into normally family routines because I suppose that's the easiest for families to follow through with. Like I mentioned at the start, heavy work is the best thing you can do for a child with sensory processing needs. And you can never have enough heavy work. So heavy work can be simple things like a weighted backpack. It can be helping out with household chores, brushing, sweeping, cleaning, all of those kind of things help give a lot of different proprioceptive feedback to the brain and the body to slow that body down and also for the child to feel more grounded in their environment.
I see.
Alongside adding just simple messy play and sensory play opportunities into bath time, even in the playground and those kind of things. If your child is avoidant of things like swings and those kind of things, helping them feel comfortable in exploring movement opportunities and a range of movement opportunities alongside engaging in play that has movement options as well, not just sedentary play. We want to kind of really engage that body and that brain in all of the occupations of the child.
Right. Is it specific to each of those senses? So, for example, if you've got a child with auditory sensitivity, would heavy work still be useful anyway? So it doesn't have to be like auditory, meaning I have to give auditory input.
So for us in sensory integration theory, what we're always trying to do is have 3 different sensory inputs when we're working on sensory integration challenges. So for auditory, because it's so closely linked to the vestibular system, movement and auditory work hand in hand. And the proprioceptive side will always help with registration. So if we're doing movement and we're doing heavy work, then it immediately helps that auditory system and the processing and sensitivities involved.
Right, fantastic. Yeah. So if a child, again, autism, because that's something we see a lot, with children on the spectrum where they might be afraid of going to places that are very crowded, very noisy, and they might be covering their ears and things like that. What else can parents do in those situations where they get very overwhelmed by the auditory input?
So I suppose from a parental level, it's more so kind of creating top-down strategies, giving opportunities for breaks, calming spaces, preparing that child before they go with visuals and things like that so they can anticipate that stimulus. From a therapy perspective, we do a lot of things like integrated listening programs. We do different vestibular safe and sound protocols, astronaut training, so that vestibular auditory system isn't over responsive to auditory stimulus, and you don't get that same response of fight or flight. But it can be very hard, and I know busy environments can be very unpredictable for children on the spectrum as well. So yeah, even it's been okay limiting the amount of time, starting off short durations and then building up that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of a sensory diet, is that something, because some parents would have like sensory boxes at home and they would get their child to engage. Is that something that you would recommend as well?
Yeah. So I suppose a sensory diet from an OT's perspective is quite different than what a sensory diet might be when you see it online or different, I suppose, more broad, generalized settings. For us, a sensory diet would be very prescribed. It would have very specific activities, and we would review those every few weeks or months, because in sensory integration theory, once we start exposing a child to a stimulus, then their brain starts to normalize it and understand it. But we need to then keep adding more and adding and changing up that challenge. So even children for regulation, we want to keep changing the regulation strategies, so that that same strategy has value over time. And also then we're still changing and building that brain. So yes, sensory has a lot of value at home and in play and sensory diets, but I'd always recommend, if your child has sensory processing needs, to get a more specific and targeted approach from a therapist as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So we've talked about parents and what they can do. How about teachers? Are there some accommodations that you think are really helpful in the classroom?
Definitely. In the classroom environment, I think one of the most powerful tools is flexible seating. So being okay with a child standing for some activities. Again, even in terms of a classroom environment, if they can move around doing tasks, that can really help their attention, their engagement, their emotional regulation, alongside having options for things like fidget boxes in the classroom after activities where a child can come in and out. And again, opportunities to come in and out of the larger classroom environment as well. Because like we mentioned, if there's auditory or if there's, again, classrooms can be very noisy and very busy. So sometimes our kids just need that space to de-escalate and to calm down and then re-enter the classroom environment again. So I think it's having an understanding of what their sensory triggers are from a teacher level, observations that it's not behavior, it's those neurological needs as well, and the child needs options and building from that.
Yes, thanks. Going back to parents again, I think because we work a lot with parents, and I think some days can be very challenging. You mentioned about meltdowns earlier. Yeah. What are some tips that you can give parents in terms of managing those meltdowns associated with sensory processing?
Yeah, I think, again, when it's a sensory processing meltdown, a lot of these kids are in fight or flight. And basically, for us as clinicians, we know at that point in time, it's trying to co-regulate yourself with the child as well. Making sure that you're calm, you're in a good space to be dealing with your child, because it can be very overwhelming that from a parental level as well. So we want to make sure that the child is safe in a safe location and not adding too much strenuous sensory or trying to redirect or shouting at them either. So a lot of these sensory kids, they're in a neurological state that they can't control. So again, if there's a calm space, a safe space, just waiting and being okay with waiting and knowing that you might have to get dressed in the morning and there might be things you need to do, but understanding that that's something that child has to work through at that point in time. And you can, of course, add sensory strategies after, things like weighted blankets, things like squeezes, fidget balls, and joint compressions. These things can be very valuable, but most of the time not during the meltdown, it's after the meltdown.
Yes. So perhaps exploring these strategies as well, finding what works, and then teaching the child to be able to maybe request like, I need a hug, because sometimes that really helps.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. Okay, so Niamh, could you tell us also, some of about the evidence base and some of the research behind sensory integration therapy?
Yes. So luckily, in the last few years, there's been a lot more research into sensory integration therapy and types of sensory integration therapy and the benefits of it as well. So Ayres sensory integration would be the one that is the most research backed, and the one where the most results have also been seen. So again, like I mentioned previously, a lot of sensory integration can get mixed up with behavioral interventions and different learning interventions. So making sure that you have a therapist that is trained in Ayres sensory integration and one that is certified, as it's a postgraduate course as well. So it's ensuring that the clinician is versed on the neuropsychology of it and also the neurodevelopmental level as well. And in terms of sensory integration theory, it's very much backed on normal typical child development. So a lot of the research ties into early milestones. It ties into a lot of different diagnoses and disorders as well. So there's a lot of research on things like stroke, different brain disorders, a lot of different brain injuries, not just developmental disorders as well. And it's actually really up and coming in mental health as well. Especially in the UK and the US, there's a lot of new and innovative sensory integration approaches for adults with bipolar and eating disorders and those kind of things as well.
Oh, that's really interesting. Maybe one last thing I want to find out about, because at your center, you've got OTs, you've got speech therapists, other therapists as well,
Physiotherapists
as well.
Yeah.
Maybe tell us a bit about how they kind of work together, in collaboration for certain clients.
Sure. We're specifically an early intervention center, and we also have a clinic with us as well. So we're very lucky to have a multidisciplinary team that allows us to cross over with a lot of the different objectives we're working on with the child. Especially in early intervention for children kind of 0 to 4. A lot of the occupational therapy and physiotherapy and speech and language therapy objectives would cross over.
Exactly,
So we're lucky to be able to have the opportunity to do joint sessions. We have lots of different equipment that speech can use. They do a lot of sensory work with children to build attention, joint attention, play skills. And from the physio and OT standpoint, we can do a lot of neuromotor work and intensive neuromotor work for children that may have cerebral palsy and Down syndrome. And we can work progressively at developing their motor milestones as well.
Right. Thank you so much, Niamh, for your time. That's so informative, and I hope that has been helpful for our viewers. Talking about the topic of sensory integration. If you've got any questions for Niamh, put it down in the comments below. All right. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm gonna pause because we're done. It was the quickest